The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold as Ethan Briscoe made his way home. The long cattle drive to Billings had taken its toll on him. His back ached from days of endless riding, his face scratched raw from the wind, and his body, weary and battered, longed for the solitude of his ranch. The only sounds that had accompanied him for the past 3 weeks were the low hum of the wind and the occasional grunt of his horse. There was no one else out here, and that suited Ethan just fine. But as he crested the ridge and saw his small ranch house in the distance, a flicker of doubt crept through him. The chimney, usually empty, was puffing out a thin wisp of smoke. The windows glowed with a soft amber light. Something was wrong. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone. He hadn't wanted anyone. His hand instinctively went to the Colt revolver strapped to his side. In these parts, a man alone was rarely safe, and visitors, especially unexpected ones, rarely brought good news. He urged his horse forward, moving cautiously, boots sinking into the soft earth as he approached the porch steps. His grip on the gun tightened. His mind raced through the possibilities, a thief maybe, or a wild animal somehow finding its way inside his house. The last thing he needed was a confrontation. But the light from the windows suggested someone was inside. He dismounted swiftly, tying his horse to the post before creeping up the old porch steps. The wood creaked under his weight, but he moved with the careful quiet of someone who had spent years on edge, years, ready to respond at a moment's notice. Ethan's gaze flicked through the thin gap between the door and the frame. The dim glow inside cast shadows, but he could see movement. Someone was there. A woman. His pulse quickened, the logic of his years in the wilderness momentarily faltering. He was alone. He was always alone. Who in the world would be here? Why, his mind cleared. Stay calm, Ethan. It could be anyone. He took a step back, preparing to push the door open with his boot. His fingers brushed the cold steel of the revolver, and his body stiffened, instincts on high alert. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, gun raised, his eyes scanning the room. The smell hit him first, fresh bread. Warm, savory something that made his stomach growl in protest. A pot of stew simmered on the stove. For a moment, he simply stared, confused, his mind racing to make sense of the sight before him. And then, standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in hand, was a woman, a stranger, her auburn hair pinned loosely, tendrils escaping to frame her face in the warm glow of the lantern light. She looked up as the door opened, her green eyes widening at the sight of his revolver. "Mr. Briscoe," she said, her voice steady and composed, despite the situation. "I hope you don't mind that I let myself in. I thought you might appreciate a hot meal after your long journey." Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned. The woman didn't seem afraid of him at all. No panic, no hesitation, just calmness. He lowered his gun slowly, his mind struggling to process the situation. He had never seen her before, but something about her. Her calmness, the way she had taken control of the kitchen, gave him pause. "Who?" Ethan's throat was dry, his voice rough from days of travel. "Who are you?" "Miss Willa McCall," she said with a soft smile. "I'm the new school teacher in Silver Creek." Her gaze swept over him, taking in his disheveled appearance. "I heard you'd be back today from your cattle drive. I thought, well, it's hard to come home to an empty house, isn't it?" Ethan stood frozen in place. He had heard the name Willa McCall, the widow from Boston who had come west in search of something different. He'd heard the town talk about her, how she had quickly earned the respect of the people in Silver Creek. Yet he had never expected to find her here in his home, cooking him a meal. "I didn't ask for your help." He finally muttered, his voice rougher than he intended. "I know you didn't," she said without a hint of defensiveness. "But I heard you were coming back, and I thought you might appreciate a warm meal." She gestured to the table which had been set for two. There was a loaf of bread fresh from the oven, and a pot of venison stew bubbling on the stove. "It's just a simple meal, but I thought it might make the evening a little easier." Ethan's gaze flickered over the table. His stomach growled again. It had been days since he had eaten anything other than trail beans and jerky, and the thought of something fresh, something home-cooked, made him feel a kind of longing he wasn't prepared for. "I didn't expect," his words faltered. "I didn't expect anyone." "I figured you didn't," Willa replied, her tone surprisingly understanding. "Most people don't nod out here. I thought you might like a change." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, still unable to fully grasp what was happening. He had been alone for so long that the idea of sharing his space with someone, especially a stranger, felt like an intrusion. Yet, the warmth of the room, the smells filling the air, the quiet flicker of the lantern light, it all seemed too real, too comforting to push away. "I don't usually let people in," Ethan finally said, still struggling to form the words. "I don't know what you're looking for." Willa smiled softly, the expression warm but understanding. "I'm not looking for anything, Mr. Briscoe. I just wanted to share a meal with someone who's been alone as long as I have." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years pushing everyone away, convinced that solitude was the only way to live. But here in this kitchen, with this woman who had no reason to be here and no obligation to him, he realized how hollow that life had been. He had never considered what it would be like to have someone simply care. "Why me?" he asked quietly, finally lowering his guard. Willa didn't hesitate. "Because I understand what it's like to come home to an empty house," she said. "I know what it's like to feel alone." Her honesty caught him off guard. She didn't seem like the type to indulge in emotional vulnerability, yet there was something raw in the way she spoke. Something he recognized. Ethan stood for a moment longer, then finally shrugged off his hat and walked to the table. He sat down, his movements slow, unsure of how to act. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with things left unsaid. "I'm not good company," he muttered, eyes still downcast. "You don't have to be," Willa replied, pouring them both a cup of coffee. "Sometimes it's just nice to have someone else around, even if it's only for a little while." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan's throat tightened as he picked up his spoon, the stew rich and flavorful on his tongue. He hadn't realized how much he had missed something so simple, something so human. And as he sat there, the sound of the fire crackling softly in the background, he knew that the quiet life he had so carefully built was about to change. But for the first time in a long while, the thought didn't frighten him. Willa McCall had let herself in, and with her, she had brought something Ethan had long ago forgotten, the possibility of a life shared. But he had no idea yet how much she would alter the course of his future. Cliffhanger. The night stretched on with the two of them sitting at the table, the conversation growing easier. And just when Ethan thought he might find some peace in this unexpected moment, Willa's next words hit him like a shock. "I didn't just come here to cook you a meal, Mr. Briscoe," she said softly. "I think you might need more than that." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What did she mean by that? Ethan had not expected a stranger to see past his walls, but Willa somehow had. Ethan sat at the table, spoon in hand, staring at the stew in front of him, as if it were a mystery he couldn't solve. The meal was simple venison stew, hearty and rich with vegetables, and the kind of warmth that could melt the coldest of hearts. But for some reason, it didn't taste as good as it should have. He hadn't realized how hungry he'd been, but now that he was eating, he felt a dull ache in his chest, a longing that wasn't just for food. He glanced across the table at Willa. She was calmly eating as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if they weren't two people who had just met two strangers sharing a meal in the heart of his isolated ranch. She looked comfortable too, comfortable, her green eyes shining with an easy confidence that seemed completely foreign to him. "You don't have to stay, you know," he said gruffly, still unable to completely push the discomfort of her presence aside. Willa raised an eyebrow, setting her spoon down before meeting his gaze. "I didn't think you'd want me to leave," she said quietly. "After all, I'm the one who cooked for you." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's not that," he muttered, his voice low. "It's just, I don't let people in. I never have." Willa's lips curled into a soft smile, not unkind, but knowing as though she could see right through him. "You're not the only one who's been alone, Mr. Briscoe." She leaned back in her chair slightly, as if considering her next words carefully. "I know what it's like to come home to an empty house, to a place that's all silence and dust. It's harder than you think to get used to that." Ethan's chest tightened, and he found himself looking away. He hadn't meant to get into anything deeper than the weather or the ranch. Certainly not to talk about the emptiness that he'd buried beneath years of hard work hours spent in solitude and a constant fight against the memories that threatened to drag him back to the war. The war that had shaped him, that had turned him into the man who didn't need anyone. The man who didn't want anyone. But Willa wasn't giving up. "I left Boston 3 years ago after Thomas died," she continued, her voice soft but steady. "It wasn't easy. I thought it'd be better to leave it all behind. But sometimes it's not the place that needs to change. It's the person." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He felt a flicker of something deep in his chest, something unfamiliar and unsettling. He had thought about leaving everything behind, too, every painful memory, every loss. The war, his family, his life back east. It had all seemed like something he could never return to, something he couldn't even face. And yet here he was, alone in his own home, with a woman who had left everything behind for the same reasons. "I'm not good company," Ethan said, after a long silence, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "You don't have to feel obligated to stay." Willa's eyes softened, but there was no pity in her gaze. "I'm not staying out of obligation, Mr. Briscoe," she said gently. "I don't think you need to be anything other than what you are. I think maybe you've been trying to carry the weight of this whole land by yourself for too long, and I know what that's like." He set his spoon down, his appetite suddenly gone. She was right, he had been carrying this weight for years, but it had never felt so heavy as it did now, with Willa sitting across from him, so calm, so unafraid. It was as if she had already seen the parts of him he had tried to keep buried, the parts he had convinced himself didn't need to be seen. He glanced at her again, really looked at her for the first time. Her auburn hair pinned back loosely with strands escaping to frame her face. Her green eyes steady and sure, as though nothing about this moment, this simple meal between two people who had just met, was anything but natural. Her presence, warm and unassuming, settled into the room like the fire in the hearth, the kind of comfort that made him feel exposed. "I don't understand," Ethan muttered, rubbing his hand over his face in frustration. "Why would you come all the way out here for a man like me?" Willa's smile softened further. "Because I know what it feels like to be seen. Really seen," she said. "I know how much we both need that." Her words hit him harder than he anticipated. Ethan's throat tightened, his mind spinning. For the first time in years, he realized how much he had been craving something, someone to see him for who he really was. Not the hardened rancher, not the solitary man who had buried his emotions beneath layers of dust and sweat, but the man who had once dreamed of something more, something that wasn't defined by his work or his isolation. "I don't know how to do this," Ethan confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Willa's gaze softened. She didn't need to say anything more. She simply reached for the bread on the table and broke off a piece, offering it to him, as if nothing was amiss. "You don't have to do anything, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "Just let things happen as they come." The simplicity of it struck him. He wasn't used to things happening that way. Life had always been a struggle for him. Nothing ever came easy. Not the ranch, not the solitude, not the acceptance of the man he'd become. But sitting across from Willa in this small kitchen on the edge of the Montana plains, it felt different. It felt like maybe he didn't have to carry everything alone. Maybe he didn't have to hide from the world anymore. The conversation shifted again, this time to the town of Silver Creek and the people Willa had met since her arrival. She spoke of her students, the challenges of teaching in a small town, and the occasional gossip that ran through the church and general store. Ethan listened, his mind wandering back to his own life in the town. He hadn't paid much attention to the gossip or rumors. He had distanced himself from everyone in Silver Creek, keeping his interactions brief and to the point. But now, with Willa's words lingering in the air, he found himself questioning that distance. Was it really necessary? Or had he just built a wall between himself and everyone else for reasons he didn't fully understand? Ethan looked down at his hands, calloused from years of labor, worn from the weight of a life he had built alone. He had spent so much time building the land, the ranch, the life he thought he wanted, but none of it had brought him peace. And now, with Willa here, sitting at his table and talking like everything could be different, he realized how much he had been missing. "Do you ever get used to it?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. The loneliness, Willa's gaze softened, her hands resting gently on the table. "No, not really. But I've learned how to fill it with something else," she replied quietly. "It's not about getting rid of the loneliness. It's about learning how to share it with someone else." Her words lingered in the space between them, filling the room with a quiet understanding. Ethan's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't with the usual anxiety. It was a strange feeling, almost like hope. He hadn't felt hope in so long that he wasn't sure what to do with it. As the evening wore on, Willa continued to talk, her voice gentle, her presence steady. Ethan listened, his mind finally beginning to quiet. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to guard every word, every thought. And for the first time in years, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the silence he had lived in for so long. But as the clock ticked on, another realization dawned on him. He didn't want this moment to end. He didn't want Willa to leave. "I think I'd like some company more often," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Willa smiled, her eyes warm. "I think I'd like that too, Ethan." And for the first time in his life, Ethan Briscoe felt the weight of the walls he had built around himself begin to crack. She wasn't looking for a hero, and he wasn't trying to be one. But in their quiet moments, they had both found something they had forgotten existed: trust. The days after Willa's unexpected visit to his home felt different for Ethan. The ranch seemed quieter somehow, even though nothing had really changed. He had always kept to himself, keeping his emotions locked away, but now there was a certain restlessness within him. The silence that had once been a comfort now felt too heavy, too thick. And Willa's face, her soft smile, lingered in the corners of his thoughts at the oddest times. He had spent the better part of his life burying his past under layers of work, but now there was a crack in the foundation, a crack that wasn't easily ignored. His days were spent tending to the cattle, mending fences, and trying to ignore the pull he felt toward Silver Creek, toward Willa. He didn't know what to make of it. She had come into his life so suddenly, so unexpectedly, but every time he thought about her, there was a sense of calmness that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't something he could explain. It wasn't love, not yet at least. But it was something that was starting to feel important. He had to admit that much. One evening, after a long day of work, he found himself cleaning up in the barn when he heard the faint sound of hooves. His heart skipped the noise out of place in the usual stillness of the ranch. He stepped outside, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver, though he quickly reminded himself that he wasn't in danger. There, under the fading twilight, was Willa. She was riding her horse, coming down the path that led to the ranch house. She had a basket of something in her hand, and the same calmness that he had seen before in her eyes was evident once again. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected her, hadn't planned for this, but seeing her there on horseback, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, made something in him stir. "Evening, Mr. Briscoe," she greeted him, her voice warm, the corners of her mouth lifted in a smile that seemed too easy, too welcoming. "Evening, Miss McCall," he replied, trying to sound as unaffected as possible. Though the truth was, he felt anything but unaffected. He couldn't help the way his pulse quickened at the sight of her. "I thought I'd bring you something," she said, handing him the basket. "A little something for your supper if you're not too tired to eat." Ethan took the basket, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment. It sent a strange warmth through him, and he cursed himself for it. He wasn't supposed to feel anything. He wasn't supposed to care. "You didn't have to," he said, his voice low, a little too thick. "I can manage fine on my own." Willa's gaze softened, her eyes holding something he couldn't quite place. "I know," she said simply. "But sometimes it's nice to share." There it was again, the simplicity of it. The way she spoke, the way she just was. He had never been good at sharing, not his space, not his time, and certainly not his heart. But in the space between them, there was a gentleness that felt different from anything he had known. He stood there for a moment, staring at the basket in his hands, unsure of what to do with it. It wasn't just food. It was more than that. It was a gesture. A kindness he hadn't asked for, but that seemed to be offered without hesitation. Ethan cleared his throat. "I don't know what to make of this." He said, the words coming out more bluntly than he intended. "You don't owe me anything." Willa stepped closer, her boots crunching on the gravel path. "I'm not doing this because I owe you anything," she said, her voice steady. "I'm doing it because sometimes it's good to help someone. To show kindness." He looked down at her, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns lining the porch. She didn't look like someone who made empty gestures. She didn't look like someone who was playing at anything. "I don't need your charity," Ethan muttered, though he didn't quite believe it. Willa didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she met his gaze directly. "It's not charity, Ethan. It's just sharing. Something I think we both need." Her words hung in the air between them, as if they were both too heavy to be ignored. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't say anything. He wasn't sure how to respond. She had found a way in somehow. A way past the walls he had spent years building, and now he didn't know how to keep them up. "I'm not good at this," he said finally, the words sounding almost like a confession. "I know," she said softly, "but you don't have to be. Not with me." Ethan's heart skipped again. Her voice was calm, understanding, and somehow it made him feel like he was standing on the edge of something he didn't quite understand. For so long, he had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone. That isolation was the price of peace. But now with Willa standing in front of him, so close, so calm, that belief seemed hollow. He stood there for a few more moments, unsure of what to say or do. But then with a deep breath, he finally nodded. "All right, come on in," he said, stepping aside and holding the door open for her. "I'll make some coffee. We can talk a bit." Willa smiled, a quiet, almost knowing smile. "I'd like that." As they walked into the house together, the air between them felt different. There was no pressure, no rush, just two people who had shared a moment of something real, something honest. They sat down at the small wooden table, and as Ethan made coffee, the weight of his thoughts seemed to lessen. Maybe it was the warmth of the fire, or maybe it was the fact that Willa was here offering him something he had never thought to ask for companionship. Ethan had always been a man of solitude, but as he handed her a steaming cup of coffee, he realized that perhaps for the first time, solitude wasn't enough. Maybe it never had been. They spoke of little things, the weather, the town, the work on the ranch, but in the quiet moments between the words, Ethan felt something shift, something he couldn't yet name. But he knew it was there in the way Willa listened, in the way she seemed to understand without him having to explain. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Briscoe felt like maybe he could let someone in. But as the evening wore on, another thought crept into his mind. Something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face. Willa wasn't just a visitor, not anymore. And though he couldn't quite admit it to himself, he was beginning to realize that his life as he had known it was about to change in ways he wasn't prepared for. But before he could give it much thought, Willa spoke again, breaking his reverie. "You know, Ethan," she said, her tone light, but somehow heavier than before, "I didn't just come here to cook for you." Ethan's heart skipped the words, landing like a quiet thunderclap. What did she mean by that? And just like that, he knew this wasn't just a simple dinner. This wasn't just a meal shared between strangers. This was the beginning of something he couldn't yet see. But it was already here, unfolding between them in ways that left him wondering what would come next. They weren't looking for a hero, and he wasn't trying to be one. But in their quiet moments, they had both found something they had forgotten existed: trust. The next few days seemed to blur into one long stretch of half-forgotten hours. Ethan woke early, his body aching from the constant work of the ranch. But his mind was filled with something else, something he hadn't experienced in years. Willa's face, her steady calm, the quiet way she had entered his life, had become a constant presence in his thoughts. It was as if, without warning, his world had shifted, and now every corner of his life seemed to echo with the sound of her name. He told himself it was just a passing moment, a temporary thing. A woman in Silver Creek, a kind gesture, and nothing more. But it wasn't just a passing moment, and deep down, he knew it. That evening, as he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hands, staring at the stars that lit up the Montana sky, he heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. His heart gave a slight jolt, even though he told himself not to let it. Willa had been to the ranch more times in the past week than anyone else in the years he had lived there. At first, the visits had felt like an intrusion, but now it was different. Now he found himself waiting for them. Willa appeared at the edge of the yard, silhouetted by the moonlight. She was on horseback, the same horse from last time, its dark coat shining in the dim light. As she rode toward him, Ethan stood, his breath catching slightly. He wasn't sure why she affected him this way, but she did. Her presence, the way she seemed to exist without fear or hesitation, unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. "Evening, Mr. Briscoe," Willa called out, her voice carrying over the quiet. "Evening, Miss McCall," Ethan replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. He wasn't sure what he was trying to hide from her, but there was something about her that made him feel exposed, vulnerable, in a way he wasn't used to. Willa dismounted gracefully, tying her horse to the post near the porch before approaching. "I thought I'd stop by," she said, her voice light but purposeful. "I wanted to see how things were going, and maybe bring you a little something." She handed him a small wrapped bundle. Ethan took it, staring at her for a moment, before carefully unwrapping the paper. Inside was a loaf of fresh bread, warm and fragrant, a stark contrast to the stale, store-bought bread he had grown used to. His stomach rumbled at the scent, reminding him of just how little he had eaten the past few days. "You didn't have to," he muttered, though part of him was grateful. He had never been good at accepting kindness, always pushing it away, like something he didn't deserve. "I know," Willa said, smiling softly, "but I wanted to." She took a seat on the porch steps close enough that he could feel the heat from her presence, but far enough that it didn't feel like she was intruding. "I've been thinking about something, Ethan. About you." Ethan froze at her words. His heart skipped a beat and he struggled to keep his expression neutral. "What about me?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Willa didn't seem fazed by his tone. She looked out toward the horizon, her gaze distant, but not in a way that suggested she was avoiding him. "I've been thinking about how you live out here all alone all this time, and how you've built this whole life for yourself, but—" She trailed off as if considering her words carefully. "But I wonder if it's really what you wanted." Ethan set the bread down beside him, feeling suddenly very aware of the distance between them. He knew he shouldn't feel uncomfortable, but he did. He wasn't used to anyone questioning the life he had built, not in the way she was. She wasn't asking out of judgment, there was no condemnation in her voice. But the question still stung. "What do you mean by that?" His words came out more curtly than he had intended, but he couldn't stop himself. Willa turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his face. "I mean that you've spent all these years alone, Ethan. Hiding behind your work, your land, and I get it, I do. I've done the same thing. But sometimes—" She hesitated, her voice softening. "Sometimes I wonder if we're just afraid of what might happen if we let someone else in. What might change?" Ethan swallowed hard, feeling an unfamiliar lump form in his throat. He had never been one to share his thoughts, let alone his feelings. He had learned long ago that the best way to survive in this world was to keep everything locked away. But sitting here listening to Willa, something inside him cracked just a little. "Maybe I don't know how to let anyone in," he said quietly, his gaze falling to the ground. "Maybe I've built these walls so high that I can't even see past them anymore." Willa's expression softened, and for the first time Ethan saw a trace of something like understanding in her eyes. "I know what that feels like," she said gently. "Believe me, I do. But I also know that we don't have to keep those walls up forever." She leaned forward slightly, her voice a whisper. "You don't have to be alone, Ethan. You don't have to keep carrying all of this by yourself." Her words hit him harder than anything else. He didn't know how to respond. He had always kept his emotions buried under layers of hard work and years of solitude, but now hearing her offer something so simple, so real, he wasn't sure how to handle it. "You don't understand." He said the words coming out almost desperate. "You don't know what it's like, what I've been through." "I don't need to," Willa replied quietly. "I just need to know that you're willing to let someone see you. That's all." Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. Ethan sat there for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to tell her that for the first time in years he wasn't sure what he was doing. The life he had built, the walls he had carefully erected around his heart, suddenly felt fragile. He had been alone for so long, convinced that it was the only way to survive. But now with Willa here, so close, offering him nothing but understanding, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Willa smiled gently, her gaze softening with sympathy. "You don't have to be ready, Ethan. You just have to take it one step at a time." For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him think that maybe, just maybe, he could take that step, that he could start to let someone in. He looked at Willa, then really looked at her, at the woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly, yet had already become a part of it in ways he couldn't explain. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel so afraid of the future. "All right," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady. "One step at a time." Willa's smile widened, and in that moment, Ethan realized something he hadn't been able to admit to himself before. He wasn't alone anymore. And that thought, strangely enough, brought him more peace than he had felt in years. The town was full of whispers, and though Ethan had long since stopped caring about what people thought, Willa was not as immune to their judgment. The days after Willa's visit seemed to drag for Ethan. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now, something that had shifted between them. The walls he'd built around himself, once so thick and high that they'd become second nature, felt less like protection and more like a cage. And Willa, with her soft smile and quiet understanding, had shown him the bars. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the change she had brought, but it was unsettling the way her presence had stirred up things he thought were long buried. The ranch seemed emptier now, even when it was still and silent, because he was no longer entirely alone with his thoughts. He hadn't wanted anyone in, not really. But now every corner of the house seemed to echo with the question of whether he was ready to let someone else in. He had heard the whispers in Silver Creek, of course. The small town had a way of gossiping, especially about newcomers. Willa's name had been on the tongues of everyone from the general storekeeper to the old men at the saloon, and Ethan knew that the town was watching them. He wasn't the kind of man who cared much for what people thought of him, but Willa was different. She wasn't from this harsh, remote place. She had come here looking for something better, something more, and the judgment of a town like Silver Creek could easily sour her dream. He had seen her once or twice walking down the dusty streets with that quiet air of grace about her, her head held high. And he had noticed how the looks followed her, those knowing stares, the whispers that always seemed to follow a step behind. In the beginning, he hadn't paid it any mind, but now every time he saw her walking past the church or entering the mercantile, he noticed it. He noticed how her eyes would momentarily lower, as if bracing for it, before she would straighten up and face it again. She wasn't immune to their judgment. Ethan didn't know why it bothered him, but it did. He wasn't used to caring about anyone enough to be bothered by what others said. But Willa, she had become more than just another person in the town. He had been drawn to her since the first night she cooked for him, and now seeing her face the same isolation he had once welcomed made something inside him stir. It was a cool afternoon when he saw her walking down the path to his ranch again. This time there was no basket of food, no offer of a quiet meal. She simply walked with purpose, as though she knew what she had to do. Ethan was sitting on the porch, his boots kicked up on the railing as he stared out over the land, but when she came into view, he sat up straighter. The weight of the unspoken between them seemed to hang thick in the air. He couldn't stop himself from feeling the pull toward her, even as he tried to ignore it. Willa stopped just in front of him, her figure framed by the fading light of the afternoon. She had a look on her face that Ethan couldn't quite place. It was determination mixed with something softer, something he didn't want to acknowledge. "Mr. Briscoe," she said, her voice steady. "Can we talk?" He nodded, trying to keep his voice even. "Sure. What's on your mind?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking to the ground before meeting his eyes again. "It's about the town, and about me being here." Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He had been expecting this, though he had tried to ignore it. He knew she had to be feeling it, the weight of the town's whispers, the way people looked at her like she didn't belong. He hadn't thought it would bother her so much, but he could see it now in the tightness of her jaw, the way her hands were clasped together, as if she was trying to hold herself steady. "I've been hearing the whispers." She continued, her voice a little softer. "And I know it's only a matter of time before the town starts to talk about us." She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "About you and me." Ethan swallowed hard. He had never been good at talking about his feelings, especially when it came to things like this. He had spent most of his life avoiding conversations like these, letting the silence do the work of keeping things in check. But with Willa standing in front of him, her eyes searching his, he couldn't keep quiet anymore. "Let them talk," he muttered, his tone sharper than he meant. "It doesn't matter what they think." Willa shook her head, her expression softening. "It matters to me. I don't mind the gossip. Not really. But I hate the idea of you getting dragged into it. You've spent years building this place, and I don't want to be the reason it all gets torn apart." Ethan stood up slowly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he looked at her. "I'm not some fragile thing that'll fall apart from a little gossip, Willa," he said, his voice gruff. "I've lived here long enough to know that people talk, but that doesn't change who I am." She nodded, but there was still something in her eyes that told him she wasn't convinced. "I know you're not fragile," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you've been alone for a long time, Ethan. And sometimes it's easier to keep things that way. Easier to shut people out and pretend it's all fine." She paused, taking a step closer to him. "But it's not, is it?" Ethan felt his chest tighten at her words. She was right. It had been easier to stay isolated, to keep his emotions buried deep where no one could touch them. He had convinced himself that it was better that way. But now, with Willa here in front of him, her words made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he wasn't ready for. He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I don't know what you expect from me, Willa," he said quietly. "I don't know how to do this, how to let anyone in." Willa stepped closer, her eyes gentle but insistent. "You don't have to know how to do it. You just have to let me in, just a little. That's all." Ethan looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if he was ready for this, ready to let someone else in, to risk the kind of vulnerability that could break him. But in that moment, he realized something. The walls he had built, the life he had made, weren't enough anymore. They hadn't been enough for a long time. "I'm not asking you to change everything." Willa continued, her voice steady. "But I want you to know that you don't have to do it alone. Not anymore." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat thick with something he couldn't name. He wanted to push her away, to retreat back into the life he knew, the life that had kept him safe. But something in her words, something in the way she looked at him, kept him from doing that. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, I'll try." Willa's smile was small but genuine. "That's all I ask." As she turned to leave, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something. A step, maybe. A step he hadn't known he needed to take. He watched her walk away, her silhouette disappearing into the twilight, and for the first time in years, Ethan Briscoe didn't feel quite so alone. Ethan had never been afraid of hard work, but building a life with Willa seemed like the hardest thing he'd ever done. The days that followed Willa's visit to the ranch felt heavier than usual. Ethan had always taken pride in his independence, his ability to do everything on his own, to carry the weight of the land and his past, without asking anyone for help. But now, with Willa's words echoing in his mind, everything felt different. There was a gap inside him, one he hadn't known existed, until she pointed it out. And the harder he tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to widen. He found himself working longer hours, pushing his body to the limit, as if the physical labor could somehow keep his mind from wandering. But no matter how many fences he mended or cattle he branded, he couldn't escape the quiet moments between tasks. Those moments when Willa's face, her smile, her gentle persistence, would creep back into his thoughts. He knew he couldn't keep doing this, burying everything under layers of sweat and dust. The problem was, he didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to let someone else in, not in the way Willa was asking. And he didn't know what to do with the feelings that had started to settle in his chest, the ones he'd spent so many years trying to ignore. It was early one evening when Jake Bennett showed up at the ranch. Ethan was just finishing up with the cattle, his hands covered in dirt and sweat, his shirt sticking to his back. He saw Jake's familiar figure coming up the path, his face grinning as usual, looking like he hadn't worked a day in his life. "Evening, Ethan," Jake called out, tipping his hat as he approached. Ethan gave him a tired nod, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Evening, Jake. What brings you out here?" Jake's grin widened as he stopped in front of Ethan. "I thought I'd come check on you. Haven't seen much of you lately. Thought you might need some company. Or maybe you just need someone to help with all that work you're burying yourself in." Ethan gave a short laugh, but there was no humor behind it. "I'm fine, Jake. Just keeping busy is all." Jake raised an eyebrow, taking a long look at Ethan before nodding slowly. "Right. Well, I reckon that's one way to deal with things. But you know, sometimes you can't work away the things that are weighing on you. Not forever." Ethan frowned, feeling an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. "What are you talking about?" Jake shrugged, his grin softening. "I've been around a while, Ethan. Seen enough men who've tried to outrun their demons with their fists and their work. Doesn't work in the long run. Sooner or later, you have to face it." Ethan stood still for a moment, his gaze dropping to the ground. He had always respected Jake, but the older man had a way of seeing through the walls Ethan had spent years building. It wasn't a gift. It was just the way Jake had learned to read people over time. "I'm not running from anything," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't press him further. Instead, he changed the subject, offering to help Ethan with the last bit of work. The two of them worked side by side in silence for the rest of the evening, but Ethan's mind never fully left the conversation they'd just had. Was that what he was doing, running, and if he was it time to stop? That night after Jake left, Ethan sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring out into the vast emptiness of the Montana plains. The sky stretched out before him, an endless sea of stars that seemed to mock his inability to make sense of things. He had never been good at dealing with emotions. He didn't know how to open up, didn't know how to ask for help. He had spent so many years learning how to shut people out that it was hard to even recognize when someone wanted to help him. But Willa had been different. She hadn't pushed, hadn't demanded anything from him. She had simply been there, offering kindness without expectation. And that scared him more than anything else. The wind picked up, and the chill of the evening seeped into his bones. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, the quiet rustling of the grass, the only sound filling the air. He was tired. Tired of fighting against something he couldn't change. tired of pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. And more than anything, he was tired of being alone. He thought of Willa then. Thought of her smile the way she had looked at him that day when she'd offered him the bread, as if she could see all the way through him and still wanted to stay. He didn't understand. It didn't know what it was about her that made everything feel different. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep pushing her away. The thought of her leaving, of her deciding that he wasn't worth the trouble, left a sour taste in his mouth. For the first time, he realized that he didn't want her to go. He wanted her to stay. He wanted to be the kind of man who could accept her kindness without feeling like he didn't deserve it. But how could he be that man? How could he change when he didn't even know where to start? The next morning, he found himself at the edge of Silver Creek, standing outside the small cabin where Willa had settled since her arrival in town. He hadn't planned to come here, hadn't even known why he was heading this way. But when he found himself at her doorstep, it felt like the right thing to do. He knocked softly, feeling an unfamiliar sense of nervousness in his stomach. The door opened moments later, and there she stood, her face lighting up in surprise when she saw him. "Ethan," she said, her voice a mix of curiosity and warmth, "what brings you here?" He swallowed, unsure of what to say. But something inside him, the same part of him that had spent so long buried under pride and solitude, spoke before he could stop it. I need to talk to you," he said, his voice rougher than he expected. Willa stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Of course," she said gently. "Come on in." He followed her inside, the warmth of the cabin immediately surrounding him. For a moment, he just stood there, taking in the space, small, cozy, and filled with the quiet scent of wood and fresh flowers. It was a far cry from the isolation of his ranch, and yet it didn't feel foreign. It felt like a place he could imagine himself being in. Willa gestured for him to sit, and he did so, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. She poured him a cup of coffee, the steam rising from the mug filling the air with a comforting aroma. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't know how to be the kind of man you think I am. The kind of man who lets someone in." Willa sat across from him, her gaze steady but gentle. "Ethan, you don't have to be anything other than who you are. I'm not asking you to change. I'm just asking you to trust me, and trust yourself." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn how to let someone in. He took a deep breath, the weight in his chest starting to lighten. "I don't want to be alone anymore, Willa," he whispered, his voice thick with the emotion he had kept buried for so long. And as he spoke those words, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone anymore. Willa's voice trembled as she spoke the words that would change everything. "I can't keep living in two worlds, Ethan, and I can't ask you to do the same." The morning light spilled into the small cabin, casting a golden hue across the wooden floors and the humble furniture that filled the space. Ethan sat by the window, staring out at the vast expanse of Montana, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had come to Silver Creek hoping to find clarity, to make sense of the pull he felt toward Willa. But now that he was here, facing the reality of what he was feeling, he couldn't help but wonder if it was all too much too soon. Willa had been quiet since he arrived, her presence calm but weighted with an unspoken tension. The space between them was filled with the echoes of everything they hadn't said, the things that lingered in the air like dust, gathering and growing heavier with every passing moment. After a long silence, Willa finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Ethan, I've been thinking." He turned to look at her, his heart picking up speed at the seriousness in her tone. What about, she hesitated for a moment, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her dress. About us. About everything. The words hung between them like an unspoken question, a question that neither of them had dared to ask until now. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. What do you mean, Willa? She exhaled slowly, looking down at her hands before meeting his gaze. I can't keep living in two worlds, Ethan, and I can't ask you to do the same. Her voice trembled ever so slightly, and it caused a sharp pang in his chest. I came here to start over, to find something real, but I'm still holding on to pieces of my past, and I don't know how to let them go. Ethan's chest tightened as her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always known that Willa wasn't just here for the quiet of the frontier. She was running from something. He had thought it was just the loss of her husband, the grief that had driven her west, but now he saw it more clearly. Willa was a woman caught between two worlds, the past she couldn't escape, and the future she wasn't sure she could build. Willa, you don't have to do this alone. He said the words, slipping out before he could stop them. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. You don't have to carry that weight by yourself. She shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. I've spent too long carrying it, Ethan. It's not just the past, it's the way I've been living, the way I've been hiding. I've been pretending like I can have it both ways. I can't. I can't keep being the woman who runs from one thing to the next, never staying long enough to see what could grow. I don't want that anymore. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths. Ethan wanted to reach out to take her hand and tell her that it didn't have to be this way, that they could figure it out together. But something inside him held back. The fear, the uncertainty, he didn't know how to let go of those things either. He had spent years keeping everyone at arm's length, convinced that he was better off alone. And now Willa was asking him to do the hardest thing of all, to let her in, to trust her with the pieces of himself he had hidden away for so long. I don't know how to do this, he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to let someone in, not after all these years of keeping everything locked up. Willa stepped closer, her eyes filled with understanding. I know it's hard, Ethan. I know it's easier to keep it all buried, to stay in control of everything. But sometimes you have to let go. You have to trust that it's okay to be vulnerable, to need someone else. I'm not asking you to do it all at once. Just take it one step at a time. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had never thought about it that way before. He had always believed that independence was the key to survival, that asking for help was a weakness. But now, standing in front of Willa, seeing the truth in her eyes, he wasn't so sure anymore. I don't know if I can, he murmured, the fear in his voice unmistakable. I've been on my own for so long, Willa. I don't know how to ask for help, how to let anyone else in. Willa reached out, her fingers gently brushing against his arm. You don't have to do it alone, Ethan. Not anymore. Her touch was soft, a quiet comfort that seemed to ease the tension in his chest, if only for a moment. Ethan closed his eyes, fighting the rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. It wasn't just the fear of opening up to her. It was the fear of losing her. She had become something he didn't know. He needed something he hadn't known how to live without. And now she was standing here, offering him a chance to start over, to build something real. And all he had to do was take a step forward. I don't want to lose you, Willa. He whispered the words, slipping out before he could stop them. Willa's smile was gentle, but there was a sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. You won't lose me, Ethan, but you have to let me in. I can't help you if you keep pushing me away. He looked at her, then really looked at her, the way her eyes held his, the way she was standing there waiting for him to make a choice. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Maybe he wasn't ready to let go of everything. Maybe he wasn't ready to open up completely. But he could try. He could take that first step even if it was just one small move towards something new. "I'll try," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll try to trust you. To trust us." Willa's smile softened, and she stepped closer, placing her hand gently on his chest. "That's all I'm asking for, Ethan. One step at a time." They stood there in the quiet of the cabin, the world outside continuing on as it always had, but in that moment it felt as if something had changed. They weren't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time they both knew they didn't have to face it alone. As Willa turned to leave, her hand brushing lightly against his as she passed, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't the same kind of hope he'd felt when he first built the ranch, when he thought hard work and solitude could solve everything. This was different. This was a hope born of vulnerability, of trust, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. But as he watched her walk out into the fading light of the evening, he knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The road ahead would be long, and the past would always be there, lingering just behind them. But for the first time, he was willing to face it. Not alone. Not anymore. Sometimes the right choice is the one that makes the least sense. Willa realized that staying meant she would not only have to fight for her place in Ethan's life, but for her own happiness. The sun was lower in the sky than usual, casting long shadows across the land as Ethan rode out to check the cattle. His mind, usually focused solely on the day-to-day demands of the ranch, was 1,000 miles away. It had been weeks since he'd allowed himself to think too much about Willa's visit, weeks since he'd let her words about letting go of the past sink in. But now, as he moved through the familiar routines, he found his thoughts drifting back to her more than ever. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep within him. Willa had made a decision. She had chosen to stay in Silver Creek, despite the weight of the town's judgment and the pull of the life she had left behind in Boston. And that choice, one that seemed so simple to her, felt like a leap of faith to Ethan. It wasn't just about her choosing him. It was about her choosing a life in this unforgiving land, a life that demanded everything and gave little in return. He knew the kind of life. It was lonely, harsh, and often full of doubt. He couldn't understand why she would choose it for herself, and he couldn't help but wonder if she really knew what she was getting into. Ethan leaned forward, urging his horse into a faster gait as he neared the herd. He needed to focus. The cattle wouldn't care about his thoughts, his doubts. They wouldn't care about Willa. But as he looked over at the vast stretch of land, something tugged at him. It was quiet out here. The only sounds were the occasional grunt of a cow and the wind as it whispered through the grass. It was in these moments of stillness that he felt it most, the nagging feeling that he had not been completely honest with Willa. She had made her choice to stay. But what about him? What was he choosing? It wasn't just about the ranch. It wasn't even about the land. Ethan could live without those things. But Willa, she had become something else. She had become someone he didn't want to lose, but he wasn't sure he was ready to let someone in. Not really. Not the way she needed him to. By the time he returned to the ranch that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. He tied his horse to the post and walked slowly toward the house where he saw Willa sitting on the porch, her back turned to him. The sight of her there waiting made something inside him stir. She had chosen this life, their life, and here she was as steady as ever with no hint of regret. Evening, Ethan, she called softly as he approached, not turning to look at him. Evening, Willa, he replied, trying to keep his voice even. But something about the way she was sitting there waiting for him, as if nothing had changed, made his chest tighten. He was afraid that by letting her in, he would only end up hurting her. Willa stood up slowly, turning to face him, and her eyes softened when she saw the conflicted look on his face. I brought you something, she said, holding up a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Thought you might like a hot meal for once. Ethan couldn't help but smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're always thinking about food, he teased lightly, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew he wasn't fooling anyone, not even himself. She smiled, her eyes warm, but there was something more serious in the way she looked at him. It's not just about the food, Ethan. It's about sharing it. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, the simplicity of her words hitting him like a thunderclap. He had known what she meant before, but this time it felt different. It felt real. She wasn't just offering him a meal. She was offering him something far more important: connection. He took the bundle from her and sat down beside her on the porch, his hand brushing against hers as he settled. The quiet between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that came from knowing someone without needing to fill the air with words. After a long moment, Willa spoke again, her voice low. Ethan, I've been thinking about us, about everything. Ethan didn't answer right away. He knew she was trying to reach him, trying to get him to face something they both had been avoiding, the truth. And yet he couldn't bring himself to say the words that were lodged in his throat. Willa turned to look at him, then her face gentle, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. I'm not asking you to change, Ethan. I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for, but I need to know if you're willing to try. The words hit him like a blow, and for a moment he could do nothing but sit there staring at the woman beside him. He hadn't expected it to feel so heavy, hadn't expected the pressure of it to settle on his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. I don't know if I can do this, he said finally, his voice rough. I've been on my own for so long. I don't know how to let someone in. Willa's eyes softened and she reached out her hand, resting on his arm. You don't have to do it all at once, Ethan. Just take one step at a time. But I can't keep living in two worlds. I can't keep pretending that I'm not here for a reason. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and for the first time he saw the depth of the choice she had made. She hadn't come to Silver Creek just to run from the past. She had come to build something, and she had chosen him despite everything. Despite the land, despite the town, despite the unspoken barriers that still existed between them. I don't know how to be the man you need me to be, he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. Willa's gaze softened, and she squeezed his arm gently. You don't need to be anything other than yourself, Ethan, but I need you to try. Because I've tried. I've come this far, and I'm not going to walk away now. His chest tightened again, and he swallowed hard. He didn't know if he could give her what she needed. He didn't know if he could trust himself enough to let her in, but looking at her, at the woman who had come into his life and turned everything upside down, he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't walk away either. I'll try, he said quietly. I'll try for you. Willa smiled, the tension that had been in the air since their first meeting finally easing. That's all I'm asking, Ethan. And as they sat there together under the quiet Montana sky, something inside him finally shifted. For the first time in his life, Ethan Briscoe felt like he might be ready to build something that wasn't just about survival. It was about something more, something real, and maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. The truth was clear in both of their eyes. Love might not be enough, but it was still all they had. The days after their conversation on the porch were filled with quiet anticipation. Ethan didn't know what he was supposed to do with the feelings that had been awakened within him. He had spent so long guarding himself, locking away any desire for connection, any need for something more than the life he had built for himself. And now, with Willa by his side, he couldn't help but wonder if all those years of solitude had been nothing more than a slow march toward emptiness. Each morning, he woke to the same routine, checking the cattle, fixing fences, and doing the endless work that kept the ranch running. But as the days wore on, he found himself thinking less about the work and more about the space Willa had begun to occupy in his life. Her presence, once a quiet force in the background, was now something he couldn't ignore. And though he tried to focus on the tasks in front of him, he couldn't help but find his thoughts drifting back to her. He hadn't meant to let her in, but somewhere between their quiet meals and shared moments, she had slipped past all of his defenses. And now here he was, standing at the edge of something he wasn't sure he was ready for. He couldn't tell her that, though. He couldn't tell her that he was afraid of losing her, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid that he wasn't enough for her. The weight of it all pressed on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. The world outside his ranch, the town of Silver Creek, had its own way of turning, and every day that passed seemed to bring more judgment and more questions. Willa had made her decision. She had chosen to stay to be here with him, despite everything. But Ethan still wasn't sure if he could do the same. It was a week later when he found her sitting by the fire, her silhouette framed by the flickering light, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow on her face. She had become a constant presence in his life, and he didn't know how to navigate the feelings that arose every time he saw her. She looked up when he entered the room, her eyes lighting up in a way that made his chest tighten. "Evening," she said softly, her voice steady, but there was something in her gaze that told him she had been thinking about something. "Evening," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. He took a few steps forward, feeling the weight of the silence that had grown between them since their last conversation. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was loaded with things left unsaid. Willa set down her knitting, her hands folding in her lap as she watched him closely. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady but filled with something deeper. He felt his pulse quicken at her words. He had known this conversation was coming, he had been expecting it for days now, but the reality of it still made his stomach churn. "I know," he said quietly, his eyes avoiding hers for a moment. "I've been thinking about that too." Willa took a deep breath, as though bracing herself for what she was about to say. "I don't know what we're doing here, Ethan. I don't know where we're going. But I know one thing: we can't keep pretending that this is easy." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "I can't pretend that it's easy for me to just step into your life and make it my own. I've tried, but I can't keep living in two worlds. I'm either here with you, or I'm not." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had known that this wasn't going to be simple, but hearing her voice, the finality of it made something inside him twist. He wanted to tell her it was all going to be okay, that he could figure it out, that they could find a way to make this work. But the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know if he could open himself up to her in the way she needed. And even more terrifying, he didn't know if he could let her go if she chose to leave. "I'm not asking for some grand gesture," Ethan Willa continued, her voice growing softer. "But I need to know where I stand. I need to know if you can really do this with me. I need to know if you're willing to open up and let me in." He swallowed, his throat dry. The words caught in his chest, but he couldn't seem to push them out. He had never been good at this, at letting someone in, at letting someone see him for who he truly was. The fear of being hurt, the fear of losing everything had always kept him at a distance. But now, with Willa standing before him, her eyes searching his, he couldn't deny that he wanted something more. "I don't know if I can," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've spent so long shutting everything out. I don't know how to do this, how to be the man you need me to be." Willa's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are," she said gently. "I'm asking you to try, to take one step forward, even if it's just the smallest step. Because I can't keep living in the past, and I can't keep waiting for something that may never come." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't sure he was ready for the kind of commitment she was asking for, but he also knew that he couldn't keep living in the space between them. He couldn't keep pretending that he didn't want her to stay, that he didn't care. The truth was, he was terrified. Terrified of letting her in, terrified of what it might mean if she left. But more than that, he was terrified of never knowing what could have been if he didn't try. "I'm scared, Willa," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm scared of losing you, scared of failing you. I don't know if I can do this, but I don't want to lose you either." Her hand found his, her fingers warm against his rough skin. "You don't have to do this alone, Ethan," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere. But you have to choose. You have to decide if you're willing to take a chance on us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan stared at her, his chest tight with the weight of the decision he knew he had to make. It wasn't just about the ranch, about the land. It was about something much deeper. It was about whether or not he was willing to let go of the walls he had built and step into a future that wasn't guaranteed. And as he looked into Willa's eyes, he realized that the choice was simpler than he had made it out to be. "I'm choosing you, Willa," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm choosing us." Her smile was soft, but filled with a quiet understanding, and for the first time, Ethan felt a weight lift off his chest. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to face it, not alone, but with someone by his side. As the evening wore on and the fire crackled between them, the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy kind that pressed on his chest, the kind that made him feel like he was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, with trust. And for the first time, Ethan felt like he was finally ready to take that first step towards something more, something real. And as Willa's hand rested in his, Ethan knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Ethan had always fought for what he wanted, but this time he fought not with his hands, but with his heart. The days following their decision to try were filled with a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. Ethan found himself waking up earlier than usual, the quiet of the morning less daunting than before. There was a sense of purpose in his every movement, as though for the first time in years he was doing something not out of obligation, but because he chose to. The ranch had always been his refuge, but now it felt like something else, something that could be shared. And yet, as much as he felt the pull of the future, there was still a lingering hesitance, a fear that something would go wrong, that the life he had carefully built would crumble under the weight of the change that was slowly unfolding. Willa had been a steady presence, more than just a companion in the quiet moments of their days. She had stepped into his world with a quiet grace, taking on the challenges of ranch life with a determination that surprised him. The more he watched her, the more he realized how much she had sacrificed, how much she had given up in order to stay. And that made him want to be better, to be more for her. But there were still things that were hard to let go of, old habits that were difficult to break. The walls he had built around himself had not simply vanished overnight. He knew Willa understood that. She never pushed him when he needed space. But there were moments, small moments, that made him question whether he was really capable of the kind of love she needed. It was one afternoon as they sat together in the kitchen that Ethan realized how much of his past was still tied to the land. He had always worked alone, carried the burden of the ranch as his own, and now with Willa at his side he was finding it harder to let go of the control he had held for so long. "Ethan," Willa said softly, her eyes searching his face. "I think we need to talk about the ranch." He frowned, setting down his coffee mug. "What about it?" She leaned forward, her hands resting on the table, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the wood. "We've been doing things your way for so long. But maybe it's time we think about the future. About what this place could be for both of us." Ethan's stomach tightened. He hadn't expected this conversation, hadn't expected her to bring up something so permanent. For so long, the ranch had been a place he controlled, a place that didn't require him to share. But now as he looked at her, the woman who had quietly carved out a space in his world, he realized that things had already changed. And maybe for once that was a good thing. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Willa's gaze softened, but there was a quiet resolve in her eyes. "Maybe it's time we bring in some help. Maybe we need to think about expanding, about bringing something new to the ranch. I know it's been your dream, but I think we could both make it something more together." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on the work he'd done, the way he'd built the ranch with his own hands. But hearing Willa's words made him realize something he hadn't fully understood before. He had been living in the past. He had been holding on to something, afraid that if he let go of it, everything would fall apart. But maybe he didn't have to do it alone anymore. "I never thought about it that way," he admitted, his voice thick with a mixture of emotions. "I've always just done what I thought needed to be done." Willa reached across the table, her hand finding his, the warmth of her touch grounding him. "I know, Ethan, and I respect that. But maybe it's time to think about the future, about what we want, not just what you've always done." He sat back, his mind racing as he processed her words. For so long he had been focused on surviving, on building a life that would withstand anything. But now as he looked at Willa, he realized that there was something bigger than survival. There was living. There was sharing. And he had never considered that it could be a shared life, a life that wasn't just about him, but about them. "I don't know how to do that," he said, the admission making him feel vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. "I've spent so long doing everything myself." Willa's smile was soft, but understanding. "I know, Ethan. But that's the thing. You don't have to do it alone anymore. We can build something together." Her words, simple and direct, held more weight than anything he had ever been told before. The idea of letting go of control, of sharing this place with someone else, truly sharing it, was both terrifying and freeing. For the first time, he realized that he didn't have to hold on to everything so tightly, that maybe, just maybe, he could trust someone else with it. "I've been afraid," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that if I let go, I'd lose it all. Afraid of losing everything I've worked for." "You won't lose it," Ethan, Willa replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here. We're in this together." The weight of her words settled over him like a blanket, warm and steady. He wasn't alone. He didn't have to carry the burden of the ranch on his shoulders by himself anymore. Willa had chosen to be with him, to face the future together. And for the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of energy. Willa and Ethan began to talk more openly about their plans for the ranch, about what they both wanted from this life they were building. They discussed the possibility of hiring help, expanding the land, and making the ranch a place that was not just about survival, but about thriving. Ethan found himself opening up more than he ever had before, listening to Willa's ideas, her vision for the future, and finding a new sense of purpose in it all. But even as they worked together, even as the ranch began to take shape in new ways, there were still moments of doubt. Ethan couldn't help but wonder if he was ready for this, ready to fully let go of the life he had known for so long. And as he worked side by side with Willa, he realized that there were still parts of himself he hadn't shared. Parts of his past he wasn't ready to face. But those doubts didn't feel like the same weight they once had. They didn't feel insurmountable. For the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't fighting alone, and that made all the difference. The ranch was still his, still theirs, but it was becoming something new, something better. And with each passing day, he felt himself stepping closer to the life he had once only dreamed of, the life he could finally share with Willa. As they stood together looking out over the land they had worked so hard to build, Ethan realized something. It wasn't about the ranch or the work or the past. It was about the future. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it hand in hand with the woman who had become his home. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting its warm light over everything they had built, Ethan knew that no matter what came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Willa's smile softened, and she stepped closer, placing her hand gently on his chest. "That's all I'm asking for, Ethan. One step at a time." The sun hung low in the sky, painting the ranch with a golden glow as Ethan finished his work for the day. The tasks were endless, but today as he set down the tools and wiped his brow, there was something different in the air, a quiet, peaceful feeling that had settled over the ranch. Willa was nearby, her soft laughter echoing from the house, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to appreciate the stillness. For so long he had carried the weight of the ranch on his shoulders, convinced that the isolation was his only way of surviving. But now as he looked around at the land that had been his sanctuary, he realized that it had become more. It was no longer just a place to work. It was a home he shared with Willa. It hadn't been easy. The road to this place, this life with her, had been filled with moments of doubt, fear, and hesitation. But with every day that passed, with every conversation they had, Ethan felt himself opening up a little more. Letting go of the walls he had built, the walls that had once protected him, but had also kept him from truly living. And in their place, something new was growing. A life he hadn't imagined, a life he was beginning to believe in. He walked toward the house, the sound of Willa's voice growing clearer as he approached. She was on the porch, sitting with a book in her lap, but her eyes lifted when she saw him. Her smile was easy, the kind of smile that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. "You're back early," she said, her voice soft and warm. "I finished up sooner than I thought." Ethan replied, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "I was thinking we could sit down for dinner, if you're hungry." Willa's smile deepened, and she closed the book in her lap, standing up to join him. "That sounds perfect," she said, reaching for his hand as he stepped closer. As they walked inside together, Ethan felt something stir in him. It wasn't just the usual pull toward her, it was something deeper, something more secure. The kind of feeling that only came when you knew you were where you were meant to be. They ate in comfortable silence, the clinking of utensils the only sound between them. Willa had prepared a simple meal, but it was enough. It always was. She had a way of making even the quietest moments feel full. And tonight, as he sat across from her, watching the way she moved and spoke with such ease, Ethan couldn't help but feel grateful. grateful for the peace she had brought into his life, for the way she had woven herself into the fabric of it, making everything seem less heavy. After dinner, they moved to the porch, the cool evening air brushing against their faces as they sat together, side by side. Ethan felt the familiar weight of his thoughts creeping in, but this time it was different. He wasn't alone with them anymore, and for once he wasn't afraid to share them. "I've been thinking about the future," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "About what we're building here." Willa turned her head to look at him, her eyes steady and full of understanding. "What about it? I don't want to go back to the way things were." Ethan continued, his voice low. "I don't want to keep holding everything in. I've spent too many years thinking I could do it all by myself, but I don't want to do that anymore. Not with you. Not with what we have." Willa reached over her hand, finding his, and her touch was grounding. It was as if the weight of his words had been lifted by the simplicity of the gesture. "Ethan," she said softly, "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm not rushing you. I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The reassurance in her voice made something in his chest loosen. He had feared this moment, feared that opening up to her would make everything more complicated. But instead, it was making it simpler. Being with her, sharing his life with her, had brought clarity where there had once been only doubt. "I know," he said quietly. "And that's what scares me, because for so long I've thought I could do it on my own. But I don't think I can anymore, and I don't want to." Willa's smile was gentle, her fingers tightening around his as she leaned closer. "That's all I'm asking for, Ethan. One step at a time." Ethan looked at her, then really looked at her, and for the first time he didn't feel the weight of his past bearing down on him. He felt something lighter, something full of possibility. Willa had given him the space to breathe, to step outside of his own fears and uncertainties, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was actually living. They sat together on the porch for hours, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl filling the silence. There was something about the stillness of the night that made everything feel right, as though the world outside their little corner of Montana had paused just for them. Ethan wasn't sure what the future held, but in this moment with Willa by his side, it didn't matter. As the night stretched on and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, Ethan realized that the hardest part was already behind him. He had faced his fear, had allowed himself to be vulnerable, and in doing so had opened himself up to the life he had always longed for. He didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but for the first time in a long time he felt ready to face it together with Willa. "You know," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had been thinking, "I don't know what I would do without you, Willa." She turned to him, her eyes soft with affection. "You don't have to worry about that, Ethan. I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, with the stars overhead and the quiet of the night surrounding them, Ethan finally allowed himself to believe it. They had built something together, not just a ranch, but a home, a family, and a future full of possibilities. The morning sun rose over the ranch with a quiet promise, its golden light spilling across the land, casting long shadows that slowly shrank as the day stretched on. Ethan stood on the porch, his hands resting on the railing, watching the cattle graze in the distance. He had always admired the land, always found solace in the vastness of it. But now with Willa beside him, it felt different. It was no longer just his land. It was theirs. They had worked together to turn the ranch into something more than just a place to survive. It had become a home, and not just a home for Ethan, but for both of them. A place that held laughter, quiet moments, shared dreams, and the promise of a future neither of them had fully expected, but both now embraced. The thought of that future full of unknowns, but built on trust and effort, brought a quiet sense of peace to Ethan's heart. Morning Willa's voice broke through his thoughts, warm and familiar. He turned to see her walking toward him, a smile playing on her lips as she stepped onto the porch beside him. "Morning," he replied, his voice soft, but filled with the affection he had come to realize he couldn't hide. He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining easily, as if it had always been that way. The bond they shared was no longer fragile. It had become something solid, something real. "I've been thinking about the future," Willa said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "About what's next for us." Ethan raised an eyebrow, turning his attention fully to her. "What do you mean I think it's time we make the ranch more than just a place for us to live?" she continued. "I want to build something here. Something that's ours, something that doesn't just belong to you or me, but to both of us. A life, a legacy, something we can both be proud of." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. For so long, Ethan had thought of the ranch as his. It had been his refuge, his responsibility, his burden. But now with Willa by his side, it was beginning to feel like something different. It wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs, and he could see how much she wanted to make it something more. Something lasting. "I've been thinking about that too," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sincere. "About what we can build together. I've always worked the land, but I never really thought about what we could create here. Together." Willa smiled, her eyes soft and filled with a quiet understanding. "I think we've already started building something, and I think it's time to take the next step." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and awe. He hadn't expected to be standing here with her talking about the future, about building something together. But now that the idea had been planted, it felt right. It felt like the next logical step in the life they had already begun to create. "We've got a good thing going," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. "But we could make it even better. Together." Willa stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his chest. "I want to make it better, Ethan. For both of us. I want to see what we can do when we're not just surviving, but thriving. We can build a family here. A future. We can make this place into something people talk about when they mention Silver Creek." Her words were bold, filled with ambition, and for the first time Ethan realized how much of her had already woven itself into the fabric of the ranch. He wasn't just sharing the land with her, he was sharing the future. And for all the years he had spent guarding his heart, this was the moment when he knew he couldn't hold back any longer. "I don't know what it's going to look like," he said, his voice hushed, "but I want to find out. With you." Willa's smile was soft, but there was a fire in her eyes that matched the one Ethan felt rising within himself. "I'm not asking for perfection, Ethan. Just for us to try, to make it work, one step at a time." Ethan leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. It wasn't the perfect moment, there would be challenges ahead, there would be doubts and struggles, but standing here with Willa, with the ranch that was now their home, Ethan realized that this was the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. "I'll try," he whispered, pulling her closer. "I'll try for you, for us." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of quiet conversation and shared tasks. Together they moved through the motions of daily life, the work of the ranch, the small moments that made up a life. But now there was a new sense of purpose in it. A shared understanding that this wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about living, about building something that could outlast them both. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Willa and Ethan stood side by side looking out over the land. The view stretched for miles, the rolling hills and wide open spaces that had once felt like an overwhelming isolation now seemed like a canvas waiting to be filled. You know, Willa said, her voice soft, I think this place has more to offer than we ever realized. Ethan smiled, his arm slipping around her waist as they stood together. I think you're right, he said. It's not just the land. It's the people who live on it. It's the life we're going to build. They stood there for a long time, watching as the sun set, casting long shadows over the ranch. Ethan felt the weight of the past, the years of solitude lifting with each passing moment. For so long he had believed that living alone was the only way to survive. But now, with Willa beside him, he knew the truth. It wasn't about surviving. It was about living. It was about building a future together. And as the last light of the day disappeared behind the hills, Ethan finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build that future. They could build a life, a family, a legacy, together. For the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of the future, of the unknown. He wasn't afraid of the challenges that lay ahead, because he knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. And that made all the difference. The educational lesson learned from this story is that life is richer when we allow others in and share the burdens and joys we carry. Sometimes we spend so much time trying to do things alone that we forget the strength that comes from leaning on those we trust. It's never too late to open our hearts to new connections, new beginnings, and the possibility of building something meaningful with others. Even in our later years, embracing vulnerability and partnership can lead to a deeper, more fulfilling life.